Hi Jane, welcome to the poetry course. So I thought I would just record you. Probably easier for me to just record you a video for a couple of reasons, than for me to send you notes. Partly because the way the course works is that it's more involved in casual discussion than in me sort of lecturing about certain poems. Um, so I tend not to have, for example, lecture notes like I might with another class. But also because it gives me a chance to just welcome you a bit more personally. Um, and I can also share on the screen the poem and just talk through it a little bit more freely. So, and just discuss some of the things that came up. So I'll keep this to about 10-15 minutes, but I thought you might like to just have a look at some of the things we thought about. The other thing to say about the course is that it doesn't follow from one week to the next, in terms we don't follow a certain tradition of poetry or anything like that. It doesn't sort of build up in that sense. It really is just isolated single hours each week where we just engage in a completely new poem. And I almost put an effort into making it as random as possible for that reason, although of course it's sometimes quite nice to refer back and say, well, this is a bit like when we looked at Jared Manley Hopkins or whatever it might be. So for that reason, it might still be nice for you to have a sense of what the class spoke about. So anyway, if I get up Howl, hopefully you've had a chance to read it or begin to read it. A lot of the class at the beginning said that they were really off put by this poem, that they found it really difficult to engage with, and didn't find it particularly interesting. And it was interesting to hear that at first. And I think a lot of them said it felt like a rant. Actually, that was one of the words that came up. So it'd be interesting to hear maybe a little bit of feedback about what you thought when you first looked at it. I was also never that drawn, even though as a teenager, was very interested in the Beat generation, which is where Allen Ginsberg is from, this sort of generation of poets and writers in the 50s and 60s that includes people like Jack Kerouac, and Neil Cassidy, and sort of a milieu that engaged in, I suppose, a life of drugs and jazz and experimental writing, and trying to capture a mode of writing that goes straight from consciousness to the page. I think they're sort of seeking after an honesty and an integrity that they felt like writing a lot of literature had lost in this sort of very crafted, formal tone it took on. So even though I was interested in that as a teenager, for some reason, Howl never appealed to me very much as a poem. But coming back to it with a little bit more knowledge of for example, the American tradition of poetry, I can appreciate actually how crafted it is, or how precise it is in what it's doing, if that makes sense. That it's not just a burble and a rant. And I think Allen Ginsberg, it would discredit him to think that he was just, happened to put this down on a page before anybody else had tried it. I think he knows exactly what he's doing. And one of the reasons I came to that thought was through hearing that he was very interested, as a lot of American poets in the 20th century were, by very, very influenced by Walt Whitman. And in some sense, Walt Whitman can be said to define what comes throughout the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century in American poetry, that is often seen as a very different trajectory to, say, for example, British poetry. And that's that it's very self-explorative, and also maybe you could say self-affirming, or has this sort of energy that comes from the self, that affirms what I have to say. Also that experiments with form, you could say a lot more, and possibly even, I might say, rhythm as well, in the sense that with all modernist poetry, that rhythm is heightened in it, a sense of musicality is heightened. But in Howl, Ginsberg even says that the reason for the line breaks is basically because he sees this as a performance poem It's meant for the breath, it's meant for the voice. And so the line breaks where it goes from naked here to dragging. The reason for putting it there is not for any kind of particular sort of significance in the meaning of the poem, but it's to guide him as to how to read it when he's reading it out loud. So that kind of thing where there's a sort of musicality to it. But if I just flip over here to this page, this is a very famous long poem by Walt Whitman. And as you can see, some of the things I said already emerge in this first stanza. And even though there is some, there are moments of recognizing something fraught in his own life, it starts with this: I celebrate myself and I sing myself. And if we go down to the end and the final stanza, it's quite a long way down. So stanza 52, you get this very famous line that Ginsberg would have known well. The spotted hawk swoops by and accuses me. He complains of my gab and my loitering. I too am not a bit tamed. I too am untranslatable. I sound my barbaric yawp over the roofs of the world. So this term, the barbaric yawp, is one that's sort of come to, I suppose, express something of how Whitman sees what he's doing in writing poetry. That it's, he doesn't want it to be elevated in this grand sense. It's not, that he's, giving the world music or something like this. It's a barbaric yawp, but it's still worth something. It's the noise, it's his animal noise, let's put it like that. His animal noise is his poetry. And I think that this is echoed in the title of Ginsberg's poem, Howl. That this is first of all, a howl is an animal noise, but it's also that this is what he's describing his poem as. It's a howl. It's a kind of, it's what humans do when they're in pain. Howling is what animals do when they're in pain. Writing this kind of poetry is what humans do when they're in pain. And I think that's, rather than it just being a long rant, this is what Ginsberg is presenting to the world, is an expression of a deep pain. And if we look at the first few lines even, and obviously it's a long poem, I don't want to bore you with going through the whole thing in a video of my own face. But I'll pick out a few things that we spoke about. And one of the things we talked about was the way that madness comes up again and again, and mental illness. And it's helpful to know that Ginsberg himself was at one point in Columbia Presbyterian Psychiatric Institute. And this was in his late teens, I think it was when he was in university. He was expelled and put into this mental institute. His mother had previously been in and out of mental institutions, and was eventually lobotomized. So he had seen the result of a misguided understanding of psychiatry and a misguided approach to dealing with it, very firsthand and in an incredibly intimate and painful way. And also he's dedicated this poem for Carl Solomon, who he met at the Columbia Psychiatric Institute, and who just before he wrote this in 1950, it was published in 1956, I think it was written in 1953, just before he wrote this, Carl Solomon had been reinstitutionalized, having come out and and like Ginsberg, tried to make his way in the world, and I think he may have already been married, but returned to his wife, and then all these years later was put back into a psychiatric institute. So I think that Ginsberg is sort of searching for, and he had a huge respect for Carl Solomon and for his intellect. And so you see here when he says, I saw the best minds of my generations destroyed by madness. starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix. This is going to be the topic of his poem, is why, how have we let this happen? Where has this come from? And I think as you go through more and more, you see that he relates it to the wider societal issues of, for example, particularly rising capitalism and industrialization. So you see things like here, that they are angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of night. So this is, so they have this sort of ancient desire, human desire, for some kind of spiritual connection. And yet it's in this context, the context of machines and the context of cities and tenement roofs. And as you go through more and more, you see these themes coming up, that in some way this search for some kind of, spiritual connection, some kind of deeper connection with their humanity and their place in the universe, is interrupted by the world that's been built up around them, the world in which they find themselves situated, which is one that doesn't really care about them, and that sort of would seem to present them immediately as victims, in quite simple terms. But I think actually, as you go through, and someone pointed this out in the class, I think it was a good thing to note, was they're not innocent either. They have just constantly, there's a litany of the kind of slightly self-destructive activities that they get themselves into. So publishing obscene odes, burning their money in wastebaskets, ate fire, drank turpentine. There's a sense in which they are also contributing to their own destruction. And it's this mess that Ginsberg is sort of putting before us and saying, this is deeply sad. It needs to be spoken. We can't just let this, we can't just live with this as if it's not an awful tragedy. So I think that in that sense, it's quite a tragic poem. So these were some of the things that we started to bring out. I think that it's interesting, and we talked a little bit about this as well. I've just got a few notes that I wrote down during the classes, so I'm just going to look here for some of the things that were brought up. I think people were interested in his influence by William Blake, and I think that I don't know how much you know about William Blake, but that he was very much a sort of saw himself as a visionary poet whose duty it was in some way to, Blake was writing at the sort of rise of the Industrial Revolution, saw very much felt like civilization was self-destructive, and saw young children working in factories, and saw the sort of torment that it was creating for his society, and was also a sort of visionary poet who had these extraordinary visions, hallucinations. People aren't still kind of trying to work out how we might medically define them, if we want to put it in that context. These of angels and of fire, Heraclitean fire, he calls it. So he's sort of he's doing, in some ways you can see how Ginsberg is sort of doing what Blake was doing. Ginsberg studied Blake really carefully and closely. He was a bit of a Blake obsessive, and so I think this trying to bring that searching for the heavenly connection, alongside railing against the let's say, dehumanization that happens in that kind of in that very kind of consumerist capitalist structure. Ginsberg would associate that with Blake very much, and you see these things coming up. He says, even here you've got the idea of Blake light. So these, here, this is, I think he's probably describing himself here, because he says, who passed through universities with radiant cool eyes, hallucinating Arkansas and Blake-like tragedy among the scholars of war. So, as if these young university students were able to have this vision in the stuffiness of the academy, and so they, here are the scholars of war, those sort of stuffy old militaristic scholars of the old academy in America, and yet these young people are so much more insightful. It's sort of what he's suggesting here, I think, who were expelled from the academies for crazy and publishing obscene odes on the windows of the skull. This is actually a biographical reference here to something that Ginsberg himself was part of his expulsion when he was expelled from the academy, when he was expelled from university. Part of one of the reasons was because he had apparently written an obscenity, I can't remember what it was now, on a window in steam, and he thought that this was an absurd element of, a reason why you should kick someone out of a university, something so ephemeral that's going to disappear in the next few hours. So here, maybe you could say there's an element of arrogance in this, and I think that I probably agree with you, and I think some of the people in the class also felt that was present, that that Ginsberg is very much defining himself and his friends as the best minds of the generation and things like this. But I suppose this is the thing. I think with a lot of poets, you kind of almost have to have a certain arrogance to be a poet in the first place. A lot of the time, it's difficult to generalize, isn't it? So anyway, I'll just say a few more things. I don't want to ramble on too much, but the other thing that I think is interesting is that this is all set in a half darkness, and you find that time and time again. So around at midnight, for example, or if we go further up, we've got the idea of waking nightmares, neon blinking traffic lights, winter dusks, here and here. And I mean, it's just throughout the whole poem, and I think it gives you a sense that this is a little more crafted than just writing whatever he can on the page, that he's thinking very particularly about this sense of there being, here we go, submarine light all night. It's all these sort of only half being able to see, this sense of a fog or something that impedes the sight. And this is I think, one image that he uses to define what it feels like to be alive in the cities of America at this time, that you have a sense that you might just be able to see something, you might be able to find some truth, but it's always slightly obscured. And that is partly by things like, partly by things like there being no night time anymore. The electric lights that suddenly confuse our natural sensibility for what is night and what is day, for how to distinguish things, how to separate them out. That these people, these young people that he's associating with, are staying up all night. They are, disrupting their sort of natural sensibilities in so many ways. One, through neon lighting, half lighting, traffic lighting, electric lighting, that keeps returning in this poem. Also through all these drugs that they're taking, which enable them to stay up late, or to sleep when in the middle of the day, or this kind of muddling of the basic kind of diurnal experience of being human. And again, always relating this back to madness, always relating it back. The other thing that people wanted to talk about a little bit actually in the class was going down to the second part 2, this very strange much more angry tone that suddenly arises here, much more energized. Moloch, solitude, filth, ugliness. And we talked a little bit about the character of Moloch. In fact, I'll see if I can just, I think Blake has a painting of Moloch. So I'll just get that up on here. So this character of Moloch. Now this is interesting. So there's two that come up here. This is actually not Moloch. This is this one here is the red dragon. But it's a very famous Blake painting. It comes from that image in Revelation when the writer of Revelation, the book of Revelation, says that the dragon is about to consume the child of the virgin and is waiting there to consume this child. So there is a sort of relationship with Moloch, because the story of Moloch, if we look at this painting, it's a little clearer actually, is that this demon demands the sacrifice of children. So you can see maybe why this is relevant for Ginsberg in this context, this particular myth, that the demon that demands the sacrifice of children, this is how he's identifying a certain element of his society, or those who are powerful in his society, that they demand the sacrifice of children. And if I find this image here, slightly more detailed, you can see here. Here we have the children being sacrificed by the state, you could say, or the sort of the power figure to the demon above, who you can't see in this image, but is up there, as you can see up there. So this is the Moloch. This is the demon that's above this state figure here is Moloch, and it's like and here you see, even though there's a sort of sadness in his face in Blake's painting, that he's nevertheless sacrificing these children to the demon. The reason I wanted to look at that red dragon is also because in the poem, so the reason when Ginsberg talks about the poem himself, he says that one of the things that that made him think of Moloch was that in a slightly drugged haze, he had stumbled across some fancy hotel. I can't quite remember where it was, maybe in Pennsylvania, I'm not sure, and had seen this modernist architecture, this sort of, you know, height of modern affluence and, you know, and the sort of the corporate world, and it appeared to him as like Moloch. Now, what that means is difficult to know, but the thought that occurred to me is that, you know, that this very famous, in Allen Ginsberg being totally obsessed with Blake, and will have had Blake's images as, you know, part of as something that informed his imagination, that this image here of the red dragon, I can imagine in some way reflecting, you know, modernist architecture, in the sense of you've got these, you know, these this sort of very strong, sort of muscular form, and these sort of triangles. Anyway, so it's just it's a complete guess, but it is. You know, it gives us a bit of a sense of what he meant when he said he felt like, you know, he saw this sort of demonic figure in the architecture of this building, and that it represented something about society as a whole. So if we go back to the poem here, the other thing is that this is a very Blakean thing to do, to bring these ancient mythic figures into an understanding of the current situation. So is as well, and this was pointed out by someone in the class, this use of exclamation marks and capitals. So you get certain random capitals like Congress or mind here, angels. This is, if you look at some of Blake's poems, in fact, do I have some here? Possibly. You often find these, well, certainly I can just open any page and you can see, no, I mean, that's absolutely tiny, so you probably can't see that there. I'll just do this here. You can see these sort of random capitals that appear on the page to emphasize the sort of the significance of a certain word. So circling around the dark demon with howlings, dismay and sharp blightings, the prophet of eternity beat on his iron links and links of brass. So there you've got demon with a capitalized D. That's an example of that. But also you do get, and I actually can't find them now, I'm flicking through, this constant use of exclamation marks and this sort of very heavily punctuated poetry. So I think that's a reference to Blake as well in that part. Just return to the poem here. So yes, I think that sort of summarizes, you know, a few of the sort of main points that we brought up and explored in the poem together. I think the other thing that we talked about a little bit was, is this a depressing poem or not? And it's interesting to say that even those who at the beginning of our discussion had said that they hadn't enjoyed the poem, or they felt like it was a big rant, quite a few of them, I think, changed their mind a little bit as we discussed it. And I'm presenting a lot of these ideas, but largely it was the class who sort of drew these things out, and they changed their minds a little bit. And quite a few people said, well, actually, one of the hopeful things about the poem is that it's ultimately addressed to someone he really loves and cares about, or it's dedicated to them rather than addressed to them. Although this last part, as you can see, is addressed to Carl Solomon, and it's, you know, the repetition is, I'm with you, I'm with you. So there is a sense that there is something incredibly tender, not just this negative, very kind of cynical rant about society, but also the sense of, this is what we need to make these connections, and not lose completely a sense of who we are. And in some sense, that cutting of that tether is one way of thinking about the kind of mental illness that Ginsberg himself experienced, and he saw his mother go through, and he saw his friends go through, that there's somehow they've been cut off, they've been both in themselves and by society. And so he's there is maybe a positive element to this poem, that he's making this connection, that he's bothering to write this down. So that's just a thought at the end, although some people said, well, ultimately there it is still a howl, it's a pain cry. So I'd be interested to hear maybe if you wanted to say a few things in response to this. There's no pressure to. Interested to hear how you interpret some of those ideas. Anyway, I'll stop it there. That's a bit of an introduction, and I look forward to seeing you later on. All right, all the best.